General Audience number 27 of May 14th, 1980. Man alienated from original love. We have already spoken about the shame that arose in the heart of the first man, male and female, together with sin. The first sentence about this beginning of shame in the biblical account is the following. Quote, "Then the eyes of both were opened, and they realized that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths." Genesis chapter 3, verse 7. This passage, which speaks about the reciprocal shame of the man and the woman as a symptom of the fall, status naturae lapse, should be considered in its context. Shame touches in that moment the deepest level and seems to shake the very foundations of their existence. Then they heard the sound of the Lord God, who was walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves among the trees of the garden from the presence of the Lord God. Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. The need to hide shows that in the depth of the shame they feel before each other, as the immediate fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a sense of fear before God has matured, a fear previously unknown. The Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" He said, "I heard the sound of your step in the garden, and I was afraid, because I am naked, and I hid myself." Genesis chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. A certain fear is always part of the very essence of shame. Nevertheless, original shame reveals its character in a particular way. I was afraid, because I am naked. We realize that something deeper is at stake here than mere bodily shame connected with the recent birth of the consciousness of being naked. With this shame about his own nakedness, the man seeks to cover the true origin of fear by indicating the effect so as not to name the cause. And it is then that God, Yahweh, instead of the man, names it. Who told you that you were naked? Have you perhaps eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat? Genesis chapter 3, verse 11. The precision of this dialogue is overwhelming. The precision of the whole account is overwhelming. It shows the surface of man's emotions in living the events in such a way that at the same time it reveals their depth. And all of this nakedness does not have only a literal meaning. It does not refer only to the body. It is not the origin of a fear related only to the body. In reality, what shows itself through nakedness is man deprived of participation in the gift. Man alienated from the love that was the source of the original gift, the source of the fullness of good intended for the creature. This man, according to the formulas of the Church's theological teaching, was deprived of the supernatural and preternatural gifts that were part of his endowment before sin. In addition, he suffered damage in what belongs to nature itself, to humanity in the original fullness of the image of God. The threefold concupiscence does not correspond to the fullness of that image, but rather to the damage, to the deficiencies, to the limitations that appeared with sin. Concupiscence is to be explained as a lack. As a lack, however, that plunges its roots into the original depth of the human spirit. If we want to study this phenomenon at its origins, that is, on the threshold of the experiences of historical man, we must take into consideration all the words that God, Yahweh, addressed to the woman, Genesis chapter 3, verse 16, and to the man, Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 to 19. Furthermore, we must examine the state of consciousness of both, and it is the Yahweh's text that expressly enables us to do so. We have already called attention to the specific literary character of the text in this regard. See TOB Audience number 3, paragraph 1. Change in the meaning of original nakedness. What state of consciousness can manifest itself in the words, "I was afraid because I am naked and I hid myself"? To what interior truth do they correspond? To what meaning of the body do they attest? Certainly this new state is very different from the original state. The words of Genesis chapter 3, verse 10 directly attest to a radical change of the meaning of original nakedness. In the state of original innocence, as we observed earlier, nakedness did not express a lack, but represented the full acceptance of the body and its whole human and thus personal truth. The body as the expression of the person was the first sign of the presence of man in the visible world. In that world, from the very beginning, man was able to distinguish himself, to identify himself, as it were, that is, to confirm himself as a person, although also through his body. In fact, the body was from the beginning marked, so to speak, as the visible factor of transcendence, in virtue of which man as person surpasses the visible world of living beings, animalia. In this sense, the human body was from the beginning a faithful witness and a perceptible verification of man's original solitude in the world, while becoming at the same time, through masculinity and femininity, a transparent component of reciprocal giving in the communion of persons. Thus, in the mystery of creation, the human body carried within itself an unquestionable sign of the image of God, and also constituted the specific source of certainty about this image present in the whole human being. The original acceptance of the body was in some sense the basis of the acceptance of the whole visible world. And in its turn, it was for man the guarantee of his rule over the world, over the earth, which he was to subdue. See Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. The words, "I was afraid because I am naked and I hid myself," Genesis chapter 3, verse 10, attest to a radical change in this relationship. Man in some way loses the original certainty of the image of God expressed in his body. He also loses, in a certain sense, the sense of his right to participate in the visibility of the world, which he enjoyed in the mystery of creation. This right had its foundation in man's innermost being, in the fact that he himself participated in the divine vision of the world and of his own humanity, which gave him a deep peace and joy in living the truth and value of his body in all its simplicity, transmitted to him by the Creator. Quote, "God saw that it was very good." Genesis chapter 1, verse 31. The words of Genesis chapter 3, verse 10, "I was afraid because I am naked and I hid myself," confirm the collapse of the original acceptance of the body as a sign of the person in the visible world. Together with this breakdown, the acceptance of the material world in relation to man seems to falter as well. The words of God, Yahweh, foretell this hostility, as it were, of the world, the resistance of nature against man and his tasks. They foretell the toil that the human body was then to suffer in contact with the earth, subdued by him. Quote, "Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the earth, for from it you were taken." Genesis chapter 3, verses 17 to 19. The end of this toil, of this struggle of man with the earth, is death. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. In this context, or rather in this perspective, Adam's words in Genesis chapter 3, verse 10, "I was afraid because I am naked and I hid myself," seem to express the awareness of being defenseless and the sense of insecurity about his somatic structure in the face of the processes of nature that operate with an inevitable determinism. In this disturbing statement, one can perhaps find the implication of a certain cosmic shame, in which the being that is created in the image of God and called to subdue the earth and rule over it, see Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, expresses itself at the precise moment when, at the very beginning of its historical experiences, that same being is in such an explicit way subjected to the earth, particularly in the part of its transcendent constitution represented precisely by the body. Here we must interrupt our reflections on the meaning of original shame in Genesis. We will take them up again next week.